There's a really long history of environmental writing shaping conservation debates and environmental policy and regulation. But environmental literature has been overlooked in terms of what it can really bring to restoration. And that's what I tried to spotlight through the book, is the different ways that different types of environmental writing can have sometimes quite a powerful role in guiding restoration practice on the ground, or contributing to policy debates, or helping to shape regulation. And I think it's that, just almost like not discounting the place that environmental writing can have for restoration.
Hey, this is Tree Hugger Podcast. I am Michael Yadrig, your host, and I am broadcasting from Tacoma, Washington, aka Grit City, and the native land of the Puyallup tribe and Steilacoom people. This is the show where we reimagine ecological restoration, and the episode where we discuss how early American environmental writings influenced early conceptions of and ongoing efforts at restoration. My guest on the show is Dr. Laura Smith. Laura is a geographer at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. She works across cultural geography and the environmental humanities, with research interests in ecological restoration and rewilding, the history and conservation of U.S. public lands, national parks, American literature, and environmental protest and activism. Her first book, Ecological Restoration in the U.S. Nature and Environmental Writing Tradition, a rewilding of American letters, was published earlier this year. 5-part biography on one hand and almost 200-year environmental history on the other, Dr. Smith focuses on the American writers Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, Aldo Leopold, Marjory Stoneman Douglas, and Edward Abbey, looking at how the connections between these writers and places and the texts produced have helped shape ecological restoration programs still much alive and well today. Dr. Smith takes us on an exploration of the entanglements between these famed writers and the places they focused their writing on. Henry David Thoreau at Walden Pond, John Muir in Yosemite and the Hetch Hetchy, Aldo Leopold at his family's Wisconsin sand farm, Marjory Stoneman Douglas in the Everglades, and Edward Abbey in the Glen Canyon. From her unique perspective, Dr. Smith lays out an intricate human geography that she says led to and continues to impact literary interventions in restoration politics. She shows us how these early writings have been used and recycled far and wide by conservationists, activists, and policymakers to defend U.S. public lands and ideas about wilderness, restoration, and rewilding. The takeaway is that we should pay attention to environmental writing because it has a powerful role in guiding references for restoration, practice on the ground, or contributing to policy debates or helping what damage, degradation, and destruction is permitted. Only reading Laura's book will do them justice, but I'll do a quick summary about the major tenets expressed by these writers, and these historical American environmental canons come from Dorceta Taylor. The transcendental writings of Henry David Thoreau, who lived from 1817 to 1862, embody the early era environmental consciousness and the thought that spiritual relationship existed between humans, nature, and God. Wildness is the preservation of the world, is what he wrote, asserting wildlands are spaces that strengthen society. Living from 1838 to 1914, John Muir's values of romanticism show a desire for remote and solitary experiences. He cherishes untamed places on the supernatural frontier of humankind where we might temporarily be free but do not linger. By the time Aldo Leopold and Marjory Stoneman Douglas were born and writing in the late 1800s, the frontier era was closed as America populated the continent from coast to coast. Leopold and Douglas's writings reflect early conservation sentiments of the land ethic, a call for moral responsibility to and relationship with the wider natural world, along with preservation that suggests at its most extreme that we foreclose human use or development of a place in perpetuity. From Edward Abbey, we often gain insights into resistance to the coupling of business and environmental interests through radical rewilding. So this reflection back on environmental literature may be one you have left on a dusty bookshelf or donated back to the bookstore, rarely thought of again. If you are professionalized in the environmental field, you probably saw one or more of these authors on a syllabus during your college years and spent some time with them alone and in a classroom. In consequence, these are the legends baked into our origin stories, ethical intentions, organizational missions, and politics. This discussion is an opportunity to crack those letters open again, to ponder where we came from collectively and reinvigorate our imaginations about what exactly we are conserving and with whom we are comrades in conservation. We might want to check out the author's legacy or inspired organizations to see how they have evolved with the times. I will link them in the show notes and name them here. So Thoreau inspired the Walden Woods Project. John Muir inspired Restore Hetch Hetchy. There's an Aldo Leopold Foundation. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was one of the first Friends of the Everglades. And Edward Abbey inspired the Glen Canyon Institute. Now, your personal reimagining of restoration might refute the blank slate of wilderness you think some of these writers were depicting in the early 1800s. These authors literally wrote the books on wilderness. Truly, early American environmental consciousness ascended during the time of slavery, Native American genocide, and the conquest of Mexico. Also, during this time, consolidation of people in the cities, rising income inequality, disease, and pollution led to elite flight and later more migration to the countryside and the expanding American frontier. Dr. Smith digs into the source texts and illustrates how some of the authors like Marjorie Stoneman Douglas wrote about this complicated background and foreground of explorers and adventurers, colonialism, slavery, military history, conflict and war, settlers, and the frontier, all of which interacted with her environment that she championed for preservation and restoration. I also want to acknowledge that not all of these authors' reputations are unblemished. In particular, John Muir wrote an abundance of eloquent yet very disparaging observations of indigenous people in the Yosemite region. After the forceful removal of Native Americans, Muir reinforced the idea through his writing that wilderness was Indian-free and peacefully open to visitors. And Edward Abbey was very liberal with his criticism against Mexicans and embedded some anti-human tones in his writing as well. The uprisings of 2020 and ongoing racial reckoning, which I hope is not over, beckoned environmentalists to grapple with how we uphold white supremacy in our movement and practices. And the temptation to cancel these guys was strong. These writers' influence continues and could continue to pervade our imagination about the failure of the human species to care for our wider environment. Despite their oversights and distrust of the other, we can still be inclusive and build our culture that includes gender equity, racial equity, and social justice. Dr. Smith and I talk about inclusion as one of the upper echelon values we need to bring into or nourish in our ecological restoration work. I'm glad to bring you this episode about how environmental history and literature shapes restoration. It starts right here. Enjoy the conversation.
I'm Laura Smith. I'm a lecturer in human geography at the University of Exeter in the UK. I really got interested in the US conservation movement and the history and politics of the US conservation movement back when I was a master's student. And I was doing some research on two sites in the UK, the Eden Project in Cornwall, which is a converted or former China clay pit that now houses two giant biomes with rainforest and Mediterranean landscapes inside. That was one of my master's case studies, and the National Forest in the English Midlands as well, so a reforestation programme spanning 3 counties. And it was while I was doing that research that a friend of mine on my master's course said that I should read Thoreau in Walden, and everything spirals from that point. So that was my first introduction into American conservation, very early American conservation thinking, and throughout my master's studies and on through PhD and into what I'm doing now, that Thoreau has been the constant, and then there have been these other writers, other organisations, other groups that have come into that mix and have led me to what I'm doing now.
So it all starts with Walden, huh? Yeah, a lot of us were maybe, I want to say forced to read the Thoreau, at some point in time. I'm sure people that grew up in New England, like they start them real early, like elementary school maybe, but some other folks that have a kind of traditional environmental education background, it might have been like as our undergraduate or graduate degrees. And he is one of the grandfathers of American conservation. And you spent time there, right? So I remember you opened the book and talking about a very interesting symposium or some sort of ribbon cutting or something that you were there.
Yeah, so the first time I went out, it was just for a week. I'd been invited to the dedication ceremony of a path that was opening for Thoreau's path on Brister's Hill in the northeastern corner of Walden Woods. And that was my first introduction to Walden and to the Walden Woods project. And so that has always stayed as perhaps one of the most vibrant memories, I think, of my PhD research was that week. And I returned to Walden the following year for a 3-month research placement over the summer. I spent time working with Walden Woods Project and Thoreau Institute on their campus and talking to lots of groups, including Mass Audubon, landscape architecture firms, the Department for Conservation and Recreation. So anybody involved with Walden restoration, really from the 80s onward. And so it was a summer of spending a lot of time in Walden and a lot of time in the Thoreau Institute library as well. So it was that real kind of mix of being able to bring page and place together where all of this really early environmental thinking began.
That's so great. It's just sort of a rare, novel experience I feel like you had, and sort of this insights that you have into ecological restoration and the classic education around it that a lot of people, I guess, don't have to a certain extent. So I really appreciate any book written about ecological restoration. And I was really surprised to see yours. And that's why I reached out to you. Given what you've already said, how do you feel like how you fit into ecological restoration? Is it now part of your identity? And what's that mean to you?
Yeah, I think so. I think my official way of thinking of myself as a geographer almost is I'm a cultural and historical geographer with overlaps in the environmental humanities. But there's a large part of me that would also say, well, actually, I'm a restoration geographer as well. But because that's not so much of an established field or an easily identifiable one, that I tend to reserve that a little bit. But I think coming to restoration as a geographer rather than perhaps someone with a more environmental science or plant science background, what I like about being a geographer thinking about restoration is that my focus is often on the kind of questioning of restoration and those ideas around the kind of the environmental philosophy and ethics of it. What do we mean when we talk about restoration? Thinking about what nature, how we define what nature is, and therefore what restored nature could become, and the why and the how that we might get there by. So it's all the connections between kind of society, place, the people involved, and the questions that we might ask about landscapes that is kind of where I situate myself as a restoration geographer.
I appreciate you. It's a novel kind of niche field or body of academic thought too. And I've started to see a little bit more here and there because I've been paying attention. I don't know if other practicing restorationists know, but I do appreciate the geographer's thought process and the stinging critiques, I think, of the ethics and the origins of where restoration came from. So I do hope you feel like you belong. Yeah, in this podcast too, saying that we're all about reimagining restoration. And so kind of departing from just that classical definition that from the Society for Ecological Restoration, essentially, that I have grown up with over the past, I guess, couple decades anyway. If what we pay attention to grows, what do you want people to pay attention to and grow when they read your book?
I think mainly about the importance of the work that environmental literature can do in contributing to restoration ideas. There's a really long history of environmental writing shaping conservation debates and environmental policy and regulation. But environmental literature has been overlooked by one or two studies in terms of what it can really bring to restoration. And that's what I tried to spotlight through the book, is the different ways that different types of environmental writing can have sometimes quite a powerful role in guiding restoration practice on the ground or contributing to policy debates or helping to shape regulation. And I think it's that, just almost like not discounting the place that environmental writing can have for restoration.
Thanks for that. That's a great segue because you write in the last chapter that Henry David Thoreau, Walden Pond, etc., with the other authors and some of their landscapes that they live with, each of these entanglements between writer and landscape has secured a place in the history of American conservation. But of greater import for restorationists is how each entanglement has also produced a literary intervention in restoration politics. A lot of us kind of think that restoration is apolitical, I think. So you're talking about these literary landscapes are politicized by the writers themselves and by conservationists, activists, policymakers, and others in defense of public lands and the idea of wilderness. One of these entanglements of page and place also emerges a cacophony of state and federal land protections. So as we consider the legacy of these authors, do you have a favorite story from your book that you want to leave behind or invite people to lean into? I know that might be tough because it's like asking people what their favorite tree is, but besides Thoreau, there's actually several other authors that are depicted in the book. So if you can tell us about them too.
Yeah, so I think the kind of story I'd like people to take away, or maybe just the chapter, would be the one about Marjory Stoneman Douglas, because she was an environmentalist and a writer that I didn't know about before beginning this book project. So it was one of the recommendations that came back from the book proposal, actually, from the publishers, was that, you've got an interesting set of writers so far, but they're all white men. The reviewers of the proposal had offered some suggestions for other writers that I might want to bring into the narrative. Of the writers that were suggested, there were some really interesting names there and things that would have been really fun to work with, but they didn't really map onto the ways of thinking about restoration that I wanted to be able to explore through the book. And by having this very clear link between a writer embedded in a place that had then directly or indirectly contributed to the ethos behind a particular environmental nonprofit working to protect that landscape. And I kind of sat with the proposal for a couple of weeks and thinking about, who else could I bring into this? And after some research, I came across Marjory Stoneman Douglas, who had been a big name in Everglades conservation and championing its restoration as well. And she became the fifth author in this. And I think I had the most fun writing that because it was the author I knew least about. So I had this chance to do a deep dive into everything that she'd been thinking about in terms of the Everglades restoration, what was going on in Miami and Florida in the early 20th century as well, and really having an opportunity to do that. Whereas for writers like Thoreau and Edward Abbey, I'd been studying them for a number of years already, and so an opportunity to study Douglas felt like a really exciting thing to do.
I would love to know what those other authors were that you ended up not really digging into, because why these four? Why Thoreau? Why Leopold? Why Abbey? Why Douglas? And I superficially knew about Douglas. Like you said, she was the only woman and she was amazing. I remember it's somewhere you talked about her age at 92. I think she lived to well over 100, but at 92, it says she was giving some speech inside this high school auditorium and she declared conservation a dead word. And this was like in 1992. And she had long positioned the Friends of Everglades as a restoration organization. And the mission statement of the Friends of the Everglades is to preserve, protect, and restore the only Everglades in the world. And I looked into this speech and it sounded like it was obviously very political because there's a lot of development interest in the Everglades and people were actively yelling at her during this speech, right? Calling her a communist and telling her to go home, granny, and stuff like that. So, it took a lot of courage to a great extent to do what she did.
And I think that phrase, conservation is a dead word, is one of those ones of hers that's kind of stuck with me, because by the time you start unpacking it, it totally gets into the kind of the myth of conservation, and the knock-on effect is what are we conserving? Who are we conserving it for? Who decides? Who enacts all of that? And those kind of questions translate onto restoration as well. And it's interesting that throughout Marjory Stoneman Douglas's writings, she is first and foremost a journalist. She began her career as a society editor at the Miami Herald, where her father was editor-in-chief, and she went on to be a short story writer, and after taking a break from the paper for the war and serving in the Naval Reserve and then overseas with the American Red Cross, came back as assistant editor. That literature and that kind of writing profession has long been there. And environmentalism, it was her father that introduced her to the Everglades problem, the question of kind of drainage, not long after her arrival in Miami in 1915. And from then on, she she took an increasingly active role in the protection of the Everglades. But when she writes about it, there's always an acknowledgement that she didn't visit it very often. And there's a great line in her book, The Everglades River of Grass, where she's kind of talking about the fact that she knows it's there and that she's been out to visit it, but she doesn't need to have this kind of very constant relationship with it. The fact that it's there and she's working to protect it is all that she needs to kind of maintain that. So there's these kind of really interesting ways of thinking about how we engage with place, and that's what I was getting at with the kind of entanglement idea as well, and the different ways that all of these authors that I focused on have in different ways built up connections and relationships with place. So the book begins with Henry David Thoreau in Walden, and it maps chronologically by author through some of these stories of approaches to conservation and the ways that projects have taken that on. So, as I said, it begins with Henry David Thoreau at Walden Pond and culminates by looking at the work of a number of conservation organisations, informal and much more formal ones, from about the 1950s onwards, all of which working to protect Walden Woods from various threats, and culminating in the work of the Walden Woods Project, which is the only one of those organisations that's still active in protecting Walden Woods today. I've looked at John Muir and his work around the establishment, his campaign for the establishment of the Yosemite National Park, but alongside his work around trying to protect the Hetch Hetchy Valley from a dam and reservoir project following the earthquake in San Francisco in 1906, and mapping that through into how the work of the non-profit Restore Hetch Hetchy is taking on some of Muir's ideas, but building a much more political and technical campaign around the call for restoration. So whereas the work of the Walden Woods Project is very much embedded in the ways that Thoreau wrote about Walden and what should be protected, with Restore Hetch Hetchy, there's less direct correlation with Muir, but it builds on some of those principles that he developed. Then I've looked at Aldo Leopold and his work around, as a restorationist. He's the first author featured in the book who can be labelled as a kind of an active restorationist, and his work beginning in the US Forest Service and how his experiences in Arizona and New Mexico, and then a move to Wisconsin, working first at the forest laboratory, and then moving to the University of Wisconsin in Madison to kind of develop some of these restoration principles, and his family's purchase of an abandoned sand farm just outside Madison as well, and how all of that and the family's experiences of restoring that sand farmstead, replanting trees, converting or restoring a cornfield to a prairie site, and all of the ways of thinking with and working with ideas of restoration that Leopold could take from his work at the university and at the Arboretum and begin to see them play out in a much smaller setting, but being there to be able to watch how these processes might have unfolded. Then the next author that's featured is Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and her work in the Everglades. And of all the authors that I've featured within the book, she's the only author to have then set up an environmental non-profit based on her kind of role and contribution within various Everglades discussions and debates. So she set up Friends of the Everglades initially to fight against the proposal for a jet port in the northern boundary of the Everglades. And from there it became an organisation that was very much focused on restoration, protecting the national park, and being quite a vocal organisation in some of the political issues that surrounded Everglades restoration. And then the final author I've looked at is Edward Abbey, and his writings, in particular in the desert southwest, focused around Glen Canyon and then later Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Powell, and Abbey's quite anarchic and often radical calls for the removal of Glen Canyon Dam through a variety of means, and how some of these writings and also those other desert writers like Terry Tempest Williams and Ellen Malloy and others, how they have helped shape some of the thinking that's going into more contemporary discussions around dam decommissioning, not just at Glen Canyon, but elsewhere on the Colorado River, American West.
Yes, that was a big tour of all of them. Yeah, and I will let you know, I was watching a webinar a couple nights ago from Jenny Liu, who's an English professor nearby, and she'll be on a future episode. And the opening slide was Aldo Leopold's quote about one of the penalties of an ecological restoration is that one lives alone in a world of wounds, right? Like that classic one. And yeah, it seems like Aldo Leopold was the first one to kind of professionalize ecological restoration. From what I remember, he's one of the early Yale forestry graduates and then moved to the American Southwest and worked as a forester, then really evolved the thoughts about ecological restoration. And thinking about Edward Abbey, I think that's one of the authors I've spent most time with. I think he has like 28 books, right? But something like that. I mean, so many. And reading The Monkey Wrench Gang and thinking that he didn't like officially kind of start any conservation organization. But from what I read in your book, he was there at one of the first Earth First rallies and actions at Glen Canyon Dam.
Yeah.
And so he had really sort of spun this idea about eco-sabotage or kind of guerrilla restoration, right? So coming from the Pacific Northwest up here, we're very much an ecosystem that's covered in trees, lots of water. And I never really appreciated the desert until I spent some time in Bolivia as a Peace Corps volunteer. And they sent me to this place that was like totally departs from my home settled ecosystem here. I remember some of the photos in the book, you actually spent some time in the Southwest, right?
Yes, so of the places and of the writers and the landscapes that I'm writing about, I had the opportunity to visit Walden during my PhD, and then Glen Canyon. I presented a paper at a conference in Salt Lake City, so that was part of a road trip afterwards. And the plan had been to spend the summer of 2020 visiting all of these places that I was going to write about in the book, and then the pandemic hit, and all the research moved online. So, yeah, I'd had an opportunity beforehand to go out to California and go to Yosemite as well, but no opportunity to get to the Everglades yet, nor out to Wisconsin either. So those are still on the list.
The bucket list. Yeah, well, hopefully, the borders are open again. Was it one of these things like you were in the middle of the trip and you just had to boogie, like you had to leave because of the pandemic?
I hadn't even made it that far. I'd got as close as deciding what sort of itinerary I would have for the summer and beginning to look at booking it, but it didn't get any further than that.
Well, someday, the places are still there, hopefully, given thinking about the pandemics we've been living through, at least one of which is COVID. Another one is kind of racial reckoning in the United States, if not around the world. You talked about John Muir and the importance of his writing and how it even influenced like presidential politics, like I think with Theodore Roosevelt's policies and legislation that preserved a lot of areas in, let's say, in California, if not wider around the U.S. It seems like Muir's legacy has been criticized in the last few years. The Sierra Club actually has been calling him out for some of his racist views. From your perspective, actually, I will say too, Edward Abbey is a little notorious as well for being sort of anti-Mexican and anti-Native American. But from your perspective, does this revisionist history cancel out Muir's and Abbey's contributions to conservation and restoration?
Yeah, I think like it's incredibly complicated, and totally with Abbey as well, that certainly both Muir and Abbey in the past couple of years have, by various groups, come under scrutiny for, writings, Muir's depictions of Native nations living in Yosemite, this idea that Yosemite was discovered by Anglo-Americans, and some, no kind of consideration of some of those issues that I think what it's done, and certainly that Sierra Club piece and other articles in The Atlantic and Smithsonian magazines as well, is that I think it's opened up conversation on, not just on Muir, but around the kind of what we might think of as like the ethics of national parks and the national parks system, that for, Yosemite isn't the only national park where native groups were dislocated and relocated from. And I think with this kind of scrutiny on Muir, that it opens up the opportunity for thinking about some of these conversations and issues that go beyond the kind of 19th and 20th century, and certainly with Abbey as well, and with his kind of quite misogynistic views, his views on immigration and gun control. That there was a great book that came out in, I think, 2017, the same year as Desert Solitaire's 50th anniversary, by Amy Irvine and Desert Cabal, and she basically calls Abbey out on all of these issues, and it's a great companion piece to read alongside Desert Solitaire. I think certainly that the past couple of years have opened up for discussion on these.
Right. Yeah, and I do feel like the positionality, I guess, of some of the authors, and being kind of coming from backgrounds where they had some privilege, right? Like Leopold having been the Yale sort of rules the world, and to a certain extent, like as an Ivy League school, and certainly coming from some backgrounds where they have some privilege and power, they were able to elevate their writing somehow, either during their lifetime or it came after their lifetime.
In kind of researching the book, what it's allowed me to do is still bring in a number of other voices. So yes, it has these 5 authors kind of guiding the discussion, but there's points throughout where there's other perspectives are brought in, and more contemporary voices, certainly for Thoreau and Muir. Like, this writing it's decades, centuries old. So by trying to look at the ways that other restorationists, other environmental humanities scholars, other geographers are engaging with these texts and thinking through some of those principles, has kind of allowed me to kind of think through how these texts might work today, and if they still work today.
That's great. Thinking about if they still work today. That's interesting. So reading or writing about some of these authors, is there one in particular, or maybe you've already talked about Douglas, but is there any other stories that empower you or make you feel courageous? We're really thinking about how we characterize leadership in ecological restoration.
Yeah, it does come back to Douglas again, I think, because I wasn't familiar with what she had done, and this was a kind of environmental activism that spanned the best part of 7 decades. It's just the different ways that she was able to open up discussion and dialogue around Everglades issues, whether that was through her columns at the newspaper and poetry that she would include sometimes in those columns, through to being part of the committee campaigning for Everglades National Park, through to her much more activist role at Friends of the Everglades, which she kind of led until her centenary year. And just thinking about the fact that, this was a woman taking on lots of these debates, taking on politicians and joining with other conservationists, other groups to kind of lead on this, that I think that she's still the one I return to. But I think there's bits in kind of Thoreau's writings as well, and Leopold's, around the kind of ethics of restoration and the kind of role of community, and thinking about what community means in a restoration context, that I think those are the authors I return to the most.
Yeah, and that kind of leads to one of my next questions, and maybe you already started to answer it, but I'll just ask it again. What values do we need to bring into or nourish in ecological restoration work, you think, as practitioners or as thinkers, should release or root out? And like, what values do we need to recover from these older ways of knowing that maybe we've forgotten about or haven't read in like these dozens, I guess, of books that are available from these authors?
I think for me, it's inclusivity, and kind of whose voices and perspectives on restoration decisions are being consulted and then translated into restoration action. And so it's all about participation, and it's the social aspect of who is part of it, and who isn't part of it, and is that, if not, then why not? And it's kind of unpicking all of those ideas around when we're talking about restoration. It goes back to that, the restoration philosophy, like when restoration is being discussed and being proposed for a particular project or location, like what nature or which nature are we talking about, and what is it that the end goal of that restoration wants to be? Is it about connectivity? Is it about, going back to some of the SCR definitions, the kind of historical fidelity? Is it something you want to do about restoring processes and allowing things to change? Or is it just the act of doing it is most important, in the sense that it offers opportunities for collaboration, for learning, for inclusion, that is what's prioritized?
That's beautiful. And I was thinking about this. There's this question my coworker asks a lot when we're out on some different sites. And, in different ways, it means a lot of different things. But often she's like, what are we doing here? It's like that question. It's like, it's so existential, but it's also like it can refer to the condition of the place and what's happened to it. It's also like, do we belong here? It also means like, who is included in this? It just means it's such a simple but very expansive question. It's just like, what are we doing here? And a lot of times it's like, whoa, we don't belong here. Or it's really just like, whoa, this is so complicated. There's so many moving pieces to it. So when you're talking, that sparked that question that's embedded in my brain.
Because it's that thing of landscapes aren't static. So through the book, what I've done is focusing on 5 writers who had particular connections to landscapes. But those aren't the only 5 authors who have A, written about those places, B, lived there, or C, had interesting things to say and do about it. So I think, it's the same with restoration and kind of planning for projects and programs, is not only like, what are you wanting to restore, and why is that what you're wanting to restore it, but actually who gets to decide that, and who's involved in that? Because if there are all these different stories and histories everywhere, but how do you approach restoration in a way that accommodates as best it can some of those different questions?
Exactly. Right. And, as Society for Ecological Restoration does, as a certified ecological restoration practitioner, SCR does have a set of principles around ecological restoration. Number 1 is engage stakeholders. So you just like talk to the people that are involved, historically maybe haven't been involved, but should be involved. The other one is drawing on different types of knowledge, right? So like Western science, we kind of got that down sometimes, but science can be very subjective, right? And very tilted to answering the questions that are guided by our biases to a certain extent. And then drawing on indigenous wisdom and local knowledge from people who live within the service shed or are most involved as part of perhaps their livelihoods in a place. Those are good take-home messages for sure. I know we're talking about America, but is there any projects near you want to highlight? I am pretty ignorant, I will say. It'd be great if you want to drop some names or talk about some anecdotes about what's going on near you.
In terms of restoration? Oh, yeah. Well, I've long been a fan of the work that the Eden Project in Cornwall are doing. So it began as a project to rehabilitate a disused china clay mine in central Cornwall. And this was part of the UK's Millennium Project scheme. So at the turn of the millennium, there was funding for these big projects around the country to kind of showcase all sorts of different things. And the Eden Project is one of these Millennium Projects. And it's recreated all these different landscapes within the confines of this china clay pit. So you have 2 biomes that I think at the time it was the biggest freestanding scaffolding unit globally. So these were enormous structures, and within these biomes there's a Mediterranean habitat, and in the other is a more of a rainforest one. And then outside you've got temperate landscapes, temperate plants as well. And for a number of years, Eden was very much focused on its kind of Cornwall setting, its kind of links with Cornish heritage, and really showcasing all those sorts of things. In the past couple of years, it's branched out and is in the process of setting up a number of other Edens around the UK and internationally as well. So there's currently plans underway for Eden North in northern England to do something similar. And then overseas projects, I think in China, I think there's one in India planned as well. So it's different ways of thinking through restoration. You might not immediately think of Eden as a restoration project, but there's kind of lots of things in that early development of the project, like the creation of soils, like it was all manufactured by reusing things from the former China clay industry, the ways that the planting is embedded, its kind of narratives around sustainability and environmental awareness, that I think that's still one of my favourite place to go. Plus, in terms of thinking about restoration and what can be, like what restoration can inspire.
Great. Yeah. I think I'll put some link in the show notes. I hope people follow the show notes because there's often like a lot of good information that we might not totally unpack, but opportunities to learn more. I think I'm in the right spot, right? EdenProject.com.
Yeah, that's the one.
It's a really cool website. All right, cool. I feel like I read a lot. I feel like you do. You might too. Are there any contemporary authors that we should be listening to at this point in time? Or how else are you keep yourself informed? Who are some restoration leaders, or kind of who do you think could help inform us?
So as other restoration geographers and other geographers who might kind of label themselves as restoration geographers, that I would definitely add David Havlick and Martin Doyle onto that list in terms of the kind of thinking through the philosophy and the mechanics of restoration geographies and these kind of geographies of ecological restoration. I think they're definitely some kind of key figures to get more of the background from this. They were particularly influential for me as a geographer thinking about questions of restoration and that. So they've both done some really interesting things. And I think, in terms of other or more contemporary environmental writers, my reading goes much beyond restoration, so it's more environmental writing more generally. And then if there happens to be an interesting restoration segue, then so much the better. I'm just trying to think what I've read recently. Last year, Penguin had released this really succinct series called Green Ideas, and it was a really slim 20-volume collection. And so the first author featured is Greta Thunberg. It also features Leopold, Rachel Carson, and Robin Wall-Kimmerer. So you've got that kind of real mix of voices, places, different ways of thinking about different types of environmental issues, all brought together in this collection. And that was great to read because they were kind of texts that I dipped in and out of before, but to have them all together was a good excuse to revisit some and to encounter new ones for the first time and think about what's that thing of why put these 20 authors together? Like what's the kind of intent behind that?
Yeah, all those people you just mentioned have declined being on my podcast. I'm joking. I reached out to the Greta's group, the Fridays group, and obviously Greta's very, very busy and important. So but there are some local youth activists around to whom I should reach out. That's like a laundry list of folks I'd love to talk to who will someday join the ranks of Tree Hugger podcast guests. This is random in the vein of talking about storytelling. I don't know if you're a podcast fan, but obviously that's like my hobby. And I'm using it as a portal to convey information to people. Do you see a role for podcasting as a form of storytelling?
Yeah.
Don't hurt my feelings. It's okay if you think differently.
No, I totally do, because it goes back to that, the different voices coming from different places, just giving an opportunity for new conversations to emerge, hearing about different stories, different histories, the kind of who and what that underpins restoration dialogues. I think it's that ability of being able to kind of talk to anyone, anywhere.
All right. So kind of wrapping up, there's questions I ask people that come on the podcast. And so I was wondering if you have a favorite tree.
It's a tricky one. It kind of comes down to context, like the place or the things I remember about, like the wider things that were happening. And so like pitch pine and white pine has to be on there for kind of my first encounter with Walden was on Brister's Hill, which was a restoration project that not only put this path that kind of highlighted some of Thoreau's writings, but it was also a restoration project to restore what had been degraded by kind of sand and gravel extraction. So the kind of pitch pine and white pine, and just being there for my first visit all the way back in 2006, that was like, those were trees that kind of stayed with me. But also I often go on a field trip to Seville. We take geography students out, at least we did before the pandemic. And the thing that always, when I think of Seville, it's the blossom on the orange trees. Like that's the memory I go to first. And I think between Walden and the trees and Seville and the kind of avenues of orange trees, that those are perhaps for very different reasons what I might say as my favourite trees.
Where's Seville? Are you talking about Spain or Seville? Oh, really? Yes. Orange trees. And there's a distinct smell, right?
Yeah. So it's because we often go kind of this time of year, so later in March. So all the blossom is out. And that's the first thing I think of. That's the first thing that triggers in my memories of Seville are the trees, rather than the architecture or the food or particular places. It's always the trees.
That's cool. All right. It's so great that you can just bop over to Seville under normal circumstances. You're like this close on the map, unlike when I look at you also. It's like, so how can people find out more information about you and your work?
So I am on Twitter. My handle is HeyDuke75, so a little nod to Edward Abbey's Monkey Wrench Gang. And I have a profile page on the Exeter University website as well.
And where can we find the book?
Yeah, I'm pretty certain it's on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, as well as, I think, direct from the publisher as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for sticking around on a Friday. Yeah, it was a beautiful book. I mean, it was took me into the Wayback Machine to a certain extent to remind me of things I maybe should have remembered or things I had sort of forgotten about. It really introduced me to some other thinkers that I was really not familiar with. So I really do appreciate you engaging with restoration and taking so much time to write about the intricacies and complexities of American environmental politics and everything. And I will encourage people to read it. So it's so great to spend time with you.
Yeah, really nice to meet you too. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick. Please check the show description for information about Dr. Laura Smith. She can be reached through the Exeter University website and Twitter at HeyDuke75. It takes a community to keep the podcast going. I am totally independent, and you can donate to help cover the small overhead for the show. I'm on PayPal at myadrick and Venmo, and you can find me at Cash App to Michael Yadrick Jr. Next up on Tree Hugger Podcast, I bring you a discussion with Jenny Liu. Jenny is a 17th century Renaissance scholar by training, environmental scientist, and now tenured English professor at Pierce College. She also calls Grit City home. We sat down to discuss identity, storytelling, our relationship with weeds, and much, much more. Here's a snippet of that chat.
Well, what springs immediately to mind is that invasive plants became a thing the same time that our country put Japanese Americans into internment camps, right? This whole rhetoric of there's this enemy amongst us and we didn't know it until now, but all of a sudden we know it and we have to exterminate it, right? For me, those things always go hand in hand. So the concept of an invasive plant, I think, is very problematic. And the concept of a native plant, a sort of line that maybe we could draw between those sort of quote-unquote natural human environmental interactions. Usually we look at the sort of industrial revolution as the beginning of that and saying okay, that's the same line we draw elsewhere when it comes to environmental stuff. This is where we start talking about these escalating human activities that have caused a new kind of harm and perhaps really tipped the scale. But somewhere in the midst of that is, if it were reasonable at all, to sort of draw a dividing line and say maybe this is when there's an outsized effect of human transportation of invasive species, then the other part of my brain rebels against that because, of course, that also aligns with our country's immigration history.
The archive of this episode also lives online at treehuggerpod.com. Tree Hugger Podcast is on social media at treehuggerpod, so feel free to point people in our direction. Subscribe, rate, and review the show, please, on whichever podcast platform you enjoy listening to. It helps people find the show. And word of mouth is very important, so tell a friend about the show. The music on this episode was from Stay Loose, DJ Freedom, and DJ Williams. You can find a link to them in the show description. Thanks for hanging out and thinking about our history.